Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's public information session on the Heavy Vehicle Mass Dimension and Loading National Regulation Amendments. I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us today to talk about the changes that are proposed for mass and dimension in the Heavy Vehicle National Law. I want to begin today's session by acknowledging traditional owners on the various lands upon which we are meeting and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge the events that occurred in Sydney yesterday and express condolences and sympathies for anyone who may have been affected. In today's session, we are going to be talking about the heavy vehicle mass dimension and loading regulations. We are currently consulting on a range of changes to those regulations that will increase allowable mass and length, as well as some other key changes to heavy vehicle operations under the law. At the moment, we're consulting on 3 documents, essentially 1 document, but we have 3 supporting artifacts. We have a copy of the draft amendment regulations. We have an explanatory document that explains the changes, as well as a consultation overview. And I should have done this at the outset. My name is Aaron De Rosario. I'm the Executive Leader of Regulatory Reform and Emerging Technologies with the National Transport Commission. And today, I'm going to be joined by Scott Britton, who will be taking you through the detail of the regulatory changes. Towards the end of the session, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat or in the dedicated Q&A area that you will find along the top toolbar of your Microsoft Teams. So what are the changes that we're going to be talking about today? There are essentially 4 items. Increasing general mass limits to the limits that currently apply under concessional mass limits, increasing the length for vehicles from 19 to 20 metres, expanding Euro 6 concessions to include road trains, and amending the tow mass ratio associated conditions for tag trailers. So they're the 4 items we'll be covering off. I'll now pass across to my colleague Scott Britton, who will talk about these changes in detail.
Thanks very much, Aaron, and good afternoon, everyone. We can just pop to the next slide, please, Michael. We'll get underway with the GML to CML increases. So first and foremost, the policy decisions made by Transport Ministers here in September 2024 were effectively to increase the current general mass limits to that which are afforded to industry currently through the concessional mass limit arrangements. So effectively, that removes red tape for industry by removing the requirement for mass management accreditation at those increased masses which are currently afforded through the CML arrangements. Key changes that derive from this policy position are effectively to extend the mass limits for tandem and triaxle groups to their equivalents that do exist under CML at this point in time. And furthermore, in order to ensure that we have continued parity across the board, to extend those same mass limits, particularly in relation to the triaxle group limit, to the equivalent of 21 tonne for both a quad and triaxle group arrangement as well. Now, those increases will operate in a similar fashion to what is currently in place for CML. That is, there is a cap on the overall increase of 1 tonne or 2 tonne, depending on whether or not the combined combination mass of the combination is either the lower or upper of 55 tonnes. So below 55, the total increase afforded is 1 tonne, and then above 55, the total increase is 2 tonne. In the existing arrangements, there is a table which provides specific axle group mass limits within the concessional mass limits within the MDL. That will be removed and then replaced with effectively a new table that will provide a mass reduction amount, which will be assist in the calculation of the overall mass increase that can apply to any one particular combination. Further to this, there will be some removal of restrictions for certain combination types that were previously excluded from the CML arrangements, and they will similarly enjoy an overall mass increase. The types of arrangements here, we're talking about truck and pig combinations with an increase on the truck only, and also then extending into Class 1 vehicles. Furthermore, and in relation to further work that's being done around the introduction of Euro 6 vehicles into the Australian fleet, there will be an introduction of a cap of 21 tonnes on the triaxle group of any prime mover or truck, so that 21 tonne limit that exists under the arrangements is not exceeded for that particular axle group. There is, however, going to be a retention of a limit on the axle groups of buses. They will not receive an increase, and that will be clearly evident within the draft regulation being consulted upon. And finally, and the important point here in relation to the process that's required to use the mass reduction amount I mentioned a moment ago, there will be no changes to the axle spacing limits that currently apply. So just moving on to the next slide then, in terms of implementing this, there are quite a few changes that come through in the regulation. Predominantly, the changes relate to the process of reduction, so introduction of new clauses for that, but mainly is as you can see in the first two images on the slide, significant changes to Table 1, Part 2, Table 1, within Schedule 1 of the MDL. So you'll see there, there's quite a number of changes to those axle spacing tables, and they will provide the new axle spacing limits under the revised GML. On the right-hand side, and you'll see the corresponding descriptions in that third table, but this third table is a new introduction into the MDL and effectively provides the relevant mass reduction for each axle group that appears within the combination. All right, so we'll move on to the next slide then. Thanks, Michael. We'll move forward to the increase in length limit to 20 metres. And this particular policy decision, again, was taken by Transport Ministers in 2024 and is effectively a measure to increase productivity of vehicles in that general access arrangement whilst maintaining swept path performance, so i.e. ensuring that these vehicles can safely traverse the network within swept path performance. This largely aligns vehicles through to the same limit as it is in place for PBS level 1, and that is 20 metres. It will allow for greater configuration flexibility of vehicles and without compromising road safety, as that swept path performance has been very much verified and validated. Now, the key changes here, obviously, there are combinations that will go through that will enjoy a length increase to 20 metres from the current 19 metre limit. They are the truck and dog, truck and pig, and truck and tag trailer, and then also the prime mover semi-trailer combination. In relation to any vehicles with a category TD, and that is from the ADR trailer, or that is a trailer with a gross trailer mass over 10 tonne, when operating in a combination greater than 19 but less than or equal to 20 metres, there will be a requirement for the latest braking technology to be in place on those vehicles, and that at this point in time, of course, is ADR 3805, so there must be full compliance with that braking provisions within the ADR, and that braking system must be powered by the towing vehicle. Now, the dimensional limits that exist for pig, truck and tag combinations, there will be no trailer changes in there in terms of any of the dimensional controls or limits there. So in relation to those three combination types, the length increase largely relates to the truck within those combinations. For the increase to 20 metres for the prime mover semi-trailer combination, however, there are some substantial changes in relation to what will be allowed. And that largely starts with three key dimensional limit increases. The S dimension, which is the distance from the point of articulation to the centre of that rear axle group of the semi-trailer, will be allowed to increase from 9.5 to 10.5 metres. The rear overhang, again from that centre of the trailer axle group to the rearmost part of the vehicle, will increase from 3.7 to 4 metres. And then, of course, those two figures added together gives a dimensional limit increase to 14.5 metres. Now, importantly for this particular part of the reform, where the S dimension does exceed 9.5 metres, those trailers must be fitted with side underrun protection that is compliant with ADR 106. If we can just pop forward to the next slide, please, Michael. Now, in relation to these combinations, you'll see on the right-hand side of the slide is the particular provisions that will be inserted into the MDL regarding the use of the braking requirements there and the definition around that heavy trailer. But more importantly, on the left-hand side of the slide is the key dimensional control when it comes to the increase of the S dimension for the prime mover semi-trailer combination. The revised arrangements will establish a ratio between, that are depicted in this table, effectively establish a ratio between the prime mover wheelbase and the maximum distance or maximum allowable distance for that S dimension on that particular trailer. So as you can see from the first entry in that table, in order to have a trailer with an S dimension of 10.5 metres, the wheelbase of the prime mover must be at least 3.5, but no more than 4.1 metres. As the wheelbase of the prime mover increases, obviously the maximum distance of that S dimension decreases, and you can see that as we work our way through each of those subsequent lines in the table. Those requirements will apply only to the prime mover semi-trailer combination, of course, but the broader requirements for the braking elements, they will apply across all combinations that are greater than 19, but less than 20 metres in length. We can pop through the next slide, please, Michael. Moving on to the concessions for Euro 6 road trains, and this is a continuing evolution in terms of the implementation of Euro 6 arrangements into the heavy vehicle fleet in this country. In 2024, in May 2024, Transport Ministers approved an increase in steer axle mass limits for Euro 6 compliant heavy vehicles. This is largely in relation to the additional mass or tear mass associated with the vehicles for increased environmental and safety control technologies fitted to these vehicles to meet Euro 6 arrangements. At the time that these changes were made, and sort of November 2024, in terms of introducing the provisions into the mass dimension and loading regulation, the road train combination was explicitly excluded. And that was largely based on the fact that there is also road trains that operate with 375mm tyres, where their steer axle mass limit is 7.1 tonne. However, this had the unintended consequence of capturing road trains operating with a 295mm tyre at the lesser 6.5 tonne limit. So effectively what is happening now in this particular tranche of the reform and in this regulation amendment is that a road train combination will be able to use a Euro 6 prime mover and be afforded the half-tonne increase as per the overall policy intent, but that will be restricted to a maximum steer axle mass of 7.1 tonne. 7 tonne, I should say. And for that, that will obviously extend the concessions to similarly to what happened in November 2024 to the B-double combination and other vehicle types within the Euro 6 arrangements. Now, for this particular increase, the steer axle of those prime movers must be fitted with tyres of no less than 315mm in section width. For the similar extension then to the twin steer axle group, there will be an extension in the maximum allowable mass on that twin steer group from 11 tonne to 11.5 tonnes. And importantly, for these types of combinations, the steer axle group must be fitted with a load sharing suspension system, and also the 4 tyres must be of at least 275mm in section width as well. I'll just pop on once more. Thanks, Michael. Now, this is largely going to be taken care of by way of amendments to the definitions that are included within the MDL. These were, of course, introduced again in November 2024. And these particular definitions effectively replace the existing definition or exclusion within the definitions for road train or bus, by removing that particular provision and then inserting the new provision which reads does not include a bus. The mass limits for these combinations are contained within the mass tables within Schedule 1 to the regulation, and they were already set at the time of the introduction of Euro 6. These adjustments merely align to those mass limits that are already included in that schedule. Just move on once again. Thank you, Michael. And then finally, moving on to the tow mass ratio for the truck and tag combination. In 2018, there were amendments to the regulation to effectively prescribe a 1:1 ratio between the mass of the heavy vehicle and the towing trailer. Since then, there have been multiple requests expressing safety concerns with the regulator and others in relation to that ratio. As part of this reform work and following a thorough safety assessment undertaken by the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator, arrangements for a new tow mass ratio will be introduced. That will effectively see the removal of the existing 1:1 arrangement, and then that will be replaced with a new ratio of 1:1.3, along with operational provisions for the steer axle group to have a mass that is greater of at least 20% of the truck vehicle mass in operation, or the manufacturer's minimum requirements per the specifications for that vehicle. We just move on to the next slide. Thanks, Michael. Finally, that's inserted in a new clause here, effectively repealing the existing 1:1 provision and then inserting the new arrangements. As you'll see in 4A, sub A refers to not more than 30%. That is effectively the replication of the 1:1.3 ratio. And then in B, we have the minimum mass, I should say, sorry, on the steer axle being the greater of the following two sub-elements there. Again, either 20% of the sum of the mass limits or the manufacturer's minimum rating for that vehicle. That is effectively a walkthrough of those arrangements. So with that, I'll hand back to Aaron.
Thank you, Scott. So very quickly, we are now opening up for questions. So you may have seen Michael has shown where you can lodge your questions under the Q&A section. If you happen to drop them in the chat, we'll be scanning the chat as well. So if anybody has any questions about the regulations, appreciate there is a lot of detail that Scott has gone through, but there is an opportunity to ask anything, or anything that happens to be top of mind about the changes we're making to the mass dimension and loading regulations. Michael, for a moment, if you could just flip to the next slide, I'll just reiterate what's required for the consultation. So the consultation on the mass dimension and loading regulations, they are open until Monday, the 19th of January. You can provide feedback via the NTC website or email the HVNL team at ntc.gov.au. The purpose of the consultation, of course, is to make sure that we are implementing the government or the ministerial agreed policies correctly. And so it is a technical review. And so we are very much interested in knowing whether there is any content in those regulations that may not be clear or may not be implementing policy in the right kind of way. We haven't as yet had any questions posted in the Q&A, so I'm just going to keep chatting for another 15 seconds or so. So if somebody does put a question in the chat bit there or under the Q&A section, we will endeavour to answer that question. Otherwise, if we don't have any questions, we will wrap that up and give you some time back in your day. So I'm just doing a last final scan. And we don't appear to have any questions. So with that being the case, I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to be here today. Thank you, Scott, for taking us through the content. Please do participate in the consultation process. It helps us make sure we get an HVNL that works for the people that need to use it. And hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.